The waters of the Pacific stretched endlessly below, a vast expanse of gray waves that disappeared into the horizon. In the cramped cockpit of his P-51 Mustang, Lieutenant James Van de Hey checked his instruments for what seemed like the 100th time. Behind him, 90 more silver fighters cut through the morning sky, their sleek fuselages glinting in the early light of April 7th, 1945. They had been airborne for more than 3 hours, having taken off from the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, and now, for the first time, they were about to see their ultimate objective. Mount Fuji rose on the horizon, its snow-capped peak unmistakable against the sky. The sight sent a jolt through every pilot in the formation. This was it, the Japanese homeland. For months, the strategic bombing campaign against Japan had relied on the high-flying B-29 super fortresses, massive bombers that made the dangerous journey from the Mariana Islands. But now, with Iwo Jima in American hands, everything was about to change. The P-51 Mustang, the fighter that had wrested control of the skies over Europe from the Luftwaffe, was coming to Japan, and the Japanese pilots who rose to defend their homeland were about to encounter an opponent unlike anything they had faced before. The battle for Iwo Jima had been one of the bloodiest in the Pacific War. More than 4,000 American Marines had died taking that 8-square-mile island of volcanic ash and rock. But the strategic value was immense. Iwo sat roughly halfway between the B-29 bases in the Marianas and Tokyo, 750 miles in either direction. For the B-29 seconds, it meant an emergency landing strip if they were damaged over Japan or ran low on fuel. For American fighters, it meant something even more significant. It meant they could finally escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. The P-51 Mustang was unlike any other fighter aircraft of the Second World War. Born from a British requirement and an American design genius, it combined speed, range, and firepower in a package that changed aerial warfare forever. Powered by the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the P-51D could reach speeds of over 400 miles per hour. But it was the range that made it truly revolutionary. With its internal fuel and 2 external drop tanks, the Mustang could fly over 1,500 miles, staying in the air for 8 hours or more. No other single-engine fighter in the world could match that endurance. When the first P-51 seconds touched down on Iwo Jima on March 6, 1945, the island was still technically a combat zone. Japanese soldiers still occupied caves and tunnels throughout the volcanic rock, and fighting continued in pockets across the island. The pilots of the 15th Fighter Group climbed out of their cockpits and were immediately handed entrenching tools. "Dig your foxholes," they were told. There were no barracks, no tents, just the black sand and the sound of distant gunfire. They would live in these conditions for weeks, sleeping in holes in the ground while preparing for the most demanding missions any fighter pilot had been asked to fly. The living conditions on Iwo were, to put it mildly, hellish. The island was a desolate landscape of volcanic ash that got into everything. Food, water, equipment, clothes. The heat was oppressive, and there was virtually no vegetation. Fresh water was scarce. Entertainment was non-existent. Some pilots called it the most hostile ground environment an airman could find himself in. But there was an unexpected benefit to the misery. With nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, the pilots could focus entirely on flying and fighting. No distractions, no diversions, just the mission. 3 fighter groups would eventually call Iwo Jima home. The 15th Fighter Group arrived first, followed by the 21st Fighter Group on March 17th, and finally the 506th Fighter Group in May. Together, they would form the 7 Fighter Command, known as the Sunsetters. Their commanding officer was Brigadier General Ernest Moore, a West Point graduate who had been in the Pacific since 1939. Moore was a hands-on leader who led from the front, landing the first Mustang on Iwo Jima and establishing the command's operational procedures. Under his leadership, the Sunsetters would develop the tactics and techniques for what would become known as Very Long-Range Missions, VLR. The longest fighter operations ever attempted. The Japanese were not expecting American fighters over Tokyo. Their intelligence had told them that single-engine fighters did not have the range to reach the home islands from any American base. The B-29 seconds they could prepare for. Those massive bombers had been hitting Japan since November of 1944, flying from bases in the Marianas. But fighters? That was considered impossible. The distance was simply too great. So when the first reports came in on April 7th that American fighters had been sighted over the coast of Honshu, there was initial disbelief. It had to be a mistake. Perhaps they were misidentified twin-engine bombers. But as more reports flooded in, the truth became undeniable. The Americans had somehow bridged the gap. Their fighters were here. Captain Art Bridge of the 45th Fighter Squadron watched as the B-29 seconds came into view over Tokyo Bay. The sight was spectacular. Over 100 superfortresses were arranged in a grand circle, assembling for their bombing run. The lowest were at 12,000 feet, with others stacked up to 18,000. Bridge's flight scissored back and forth above the bomber stream, maintaining position without getting ahead. It was his job to provide top cover, to watch for the Japanese interceptors that would inevitably come. They didn't have to wait long. The first Japanese fighters appeared as head-on attackers, diving out of the sun toward the bomber formation. More than 100 enemy aircraft were rising to meet them. The Americans dropped their external wing tanks and pushed their throttles forward. The Mustangs surged ahead, climbing to engage. In minutes, more than 300 aircraft were tangled in a massive aerial battle over Tokyo Bay, with anti-aircraft fire bursting among them like black flowers blooming and fading. For the Japanese pilots, this first encounter with the P-51 over their homeland was a revelation, and not a pleasant one. They had grown accustomed to fighting the carrier-based F-6, F Hellcats, and F-4U Corsairs of the U.S. Navy, both excellent aircraft but with limitations. The Corsair in particular had some difficulties at high altitude. But the Mustang was something different. It was fast. Faster than anything they had. It could climb with their best interceptors. And most importantly, it could stay. The Japanese pilots were used to American fighters that could only remain over the target for a few minutes before having to turn back due to fuel constraints. The P-51 could loiter for more than 2 hours over Tokyo. This changed everything. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Force had been preparing for the defense of the homeland for months. They knew the B-29 raids were coming and would only intensify as the war drew to its inevitable conclusion. They had positioned their best units around Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. They had stockpiled aircraft. They had developed new tactics specifically for attacking the high-flying superfortresses. But all of those plans had assumed they would only be facing the bombers themselves with their heavy defensive armament but relative lack of maneuverability. Adding long-range escort fighters to the equation changed the calculus completely. The Japanese had 10 different fighter types defending the Tokyo area. The oldest was the venerable Mitsubishi A6M0, the fighter that had shocked the world with its performance in the early days of the Pacific War. But by 1945, the Zero was hopelessly outclassed. It was too slow, too lightly built, and armed with weapons that were no longer adequate against modern American aircraft. Still, it remained in service in large numbers, flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots who had received minimal training. More capable were the Army's interceptors. The Nakajima-ki 44 Shoki, codenamed Tojo by the Allies, was a dedicated interceptor designed for speed and climb rate rather than maneuverability. Some variants mounted 40mm cannons specifically for attacking B-29 seconds. The Kawasaki Ki 61 Hien, called Tony by the Americans, was unique among Japanese fighters in having a liquid-cooled inline engine, a license-built version of the German Daimler-Benz. With proper maintenance and high-quality fuel, it could perform well at high altitude, making it valuable against the B-29 seconds. But the best fighter the Japanese had in significant numbers was the Nakajima-ki 84 Hayate, codenamed Frank. The Hayate, which meant gale in Japanese, was by any measure an exceptional aircraft. It combined speed, maneuverability, and heavy firepower in a way no previous Japanese fighter had achieved. First flown in March 1943, it could reach nearly 400 miles per hour and carried either 4 20mm cannons or a mix of 30mm cannons and machine guns. In terms of raw performance, it was competitive with anything the Allies had, including the P-51. On paper, the Frank should have been a war winner. American test pilots who flew captured examples were impressed. One noted that it was faster than the Mustang at certain altitudes. Another commented that if the Japanese had been able to produce it in quantity earlier in the war with adequate quality control, it could have significantly impacted the outcome. But there was the problem. By the time the Ki-84 reached frontline units in large numbers, Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing under the weight of the American bombing campaign and the naval blockade that was strangling the island nation. The Haite suffered from chronic reliability issues that had nothing to do with its design. The Ha-45 Homari engine was temperamental and required high-quality fuel and meticulous maintenance, neither of which were readily available in 1945. The landing gear had a tendency to collapse on rough fields. Quality control in the factories was deteriorating rapidly, as skilled workers were drafted into military service and replaced with unskilled labor, including school children. Components that should have been precisely machined were often out of specification. Heat treatment of critical steel parts was inconsistent, leading to failures at the worst possible moments. Moreover, Japan was facing a catastrophic shortage of trained pilots. The years of attrition warfare in China, the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Philippines had bled the Japanese Air Forces white. The experienced pilots who had trained for years before the war were nearly all gone, dead or too few to make a difference. Their replacements received only a fraction of the training. Where pre-war pilots might have had over 1,000 hours of flight time before seeing combat, by 1945, new pilots were being sent to operational units with as little as 100 hours. Some had never fired their guns at a moving target. Few had any training in formation flying or modern air combat tactics. They were being thrown into battle against American pilots who averaged 300 hours of training and were flying a fighter that was in many ways superior to what the Japanese could field. The American pilots soon recognized the disparity in training. In the dogfights over Japan, they found that while some Japanese pilots were skilled and aggressive, many seemed confused and uncertain. Japanese formations were often loose and poorly coordinated. Individual pilots made basic mistakes, allowing themselves to be caught in vulnerable positions. The Americans developed a grim sense of professional pity. These Japanese pilots were brave, certainly. They pressed their attacks with determination, sometimes to the point of apparent suicide. But courage without skill was not enough. Not against the Mustang, not against pilots who had been trained to the highest standard the U.S. Army Air Forces could provide. The first VLR mission on April 7th set the pattern for the months to come. The Americans claimed 26 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with 1 probable and 5 damaged. 2 P-51 seconds were lost, with 1 pilot missing. 3 B-29 seconds went down, 2 to anti-aircraft fire and 1 to a collision with a Japanese aerial bomb, a tactic where an enemy fighter would drop a bomb into the bomber formation. It was an auspicious beginning. The escort had worked, the bombers had been protected, and the Japanese had been shown that the skies over their homeland were no longer safe. But the pilots of 7th Fighter Command quickly learned that the enemy was not their primary concern. The real challenges of VLR operations were far more fundamental. Navigation, weather, fuel management, fatigue. These were the factors that would kill far more American pilots than enemy action ever would. The missions required flying over 700 miles of open ocean, often through terrible weather, to reach Japan. Then engaging in combat, burning precious fuel, then making the long journey home, often low on fuel, in deteriorating weather, exhausted from 8 or more hours strapped into a cramped cockpit. Navigation was the first challenge. In clear weather, with good visibility, a pilot could use dead reckoning, calculating his position based on time, speed, and heading. But over the featureless Pacific Ocean, there were no landmarks, no reference points, nothing but water in every direction. Cloud cover could obscure the sun, making it impossible to use it for navigation. At night, the stars might be visible, but often they were not. So the pilots relied on radio navigation aids, primitive by modern standards, but the best technology available at the time. The primary system was called YG, a radio homing device. It consisted of 2 antennas mounted on the rear fuselage of the P-51, tuned a quarter wavelength apart. The system would receive signals from either the base on Iwo Jima or from specially equipped B-29 seconds that accompanied the fighter formations. The right antenna would give a signal that sounded like the Morse code letter U, dit dit da. The left antenna gave the letter D, da dit dit. By turning toward the appropriate signal and adjusting until both were received simultaneously, producing a steady hum, the pilot could maintain a course toward home. It was ingenious, but it required the radio to be working, the transmitter to be operating, and the pilot to be able to hear the signals over engine noise and radio chatter. Any one of those factors could fail, and often did. Weather was an even greater nemesis. The North Pacific in spring and summer was notorious for rapid weather changes and violent storms. Massive frontal systems would build up between the Marianas and Japan, moving north with the season. These systems could extend from sea level to 40,000 feet, with turbulence that could tear an aircraft apart, icing that could bring down even the most powerful fighter, and zero visibility that could disorient a pilot in seconds. Flying through these systems required instrument skills, steady nerves, and sometimes sheer luck. June 1st, 1945, became known among the Mustang pilots as Black Friday. It was the single worst day in the entire VLR campaign, a day when the weather killed more Americans than enemy action would claim in months of combat. 150 P-51 seconds from all three fighter groups took off that morning to escort B 29 seconds to Osaka. Intelligence had warned of a frontal system between Iwo Jima and Japan, but the mission was deemed essential. The bombers had to get through, so the order was given, go. The fighters assembled over Iwo and headed north. For a while, conditions were acceptable. Some clouds, but manageable. Then, about halfway to the rendezvous point, they hit the front. What had been reported as moderate weather turned out to be a maelstrom. Visibility dropped to near zero. Rain mixed with snow battered the aircraft. Ice formed on wings and canopies. Turbulence threw the Mustangs around the sky like toys. Pilots struggled to maintain control, to keep their aircraft upright, to avoid colliding with their wingmen who were somewhere in the murk nearby. The formations disintegrated. Pilots lost visual contact with their leaders, with their wingmen, with everyone. They were alone in the storm, flying on instruments, trying to maintain altitude and heading while their aircraft bucked and rolled. Some tried to climb above the weather. Others descended, hoping to find clear air below. A few attempted to turn back to Iwo Jima. All of these decisions were made in moments, by exhausted men in cramped cockpits, with incomplete information and mounting fear. 27 P-51 seconds were lost that day, 25 pilots died, only a handful made it to the rendezvous point with the B 29 seconds. One of those pilots, Bob Graham of the 462nd Squadron, survived by forming up tight on a B-29 and following it through the weather to the target and back. The bomber crew essentially escorted the fighter home, a role reversal that probably saved Graham's life. Another pilot, Bob Scamara, made it back to Iwo after nearly 9 hours in the air, landing with his fuel tanks almost completely dry. Larry Grennan bailed out near Iwo and was rescued from the water by Navy search and rescue. He was one of the lucky ones. Black Friday was the largest single loss of Mustangs in any mission in either Europe or Asia during the entire Second World War. It was a devastating blow to 7 Fighter Command, and it drove home the reality that the weather was a more dangerous enemy than the Japanese fighters would ever be. An investigation followed. Questions were asked. Should the mission have been aborted? Should the fighters have turned back when they hit the front? The answers were complicated. Yes, in hindsight, the mission should probably have been called off. But how could commanders sitting on Iwo Jima know how bad the weather really was until the pilots were already committed? And with the strategic bombing campaign ramping up to its maximum intensity, could they afford to cancel missions every time the weather looked threatening? There were no good answers, only hard lessons learned in blood. Despite the catastrophe of Black Friday, the VLR missions continued. By the time the war ended in August, the 7th Fighter Command would fly 51 missions to Japan. The routine became almost mechanical, though it never became easy. Wake up before dawn, pre-flight briefing, check weather reports, though they were often wrong. Check the aircraft, every switch, every gauge, every control surface. Test the guns, ensure the external tanks were properly installed and fueled. Strap into the cockpit, already feeling the heat of the day building. Start the engine, that beautiful Merlin V12 rumbling to life. Taxi to the runway, careful not to let the tail wheel slip off into the volcanic ash. Take off, sometimes, from runways that were still being repaired from Japanese shelling the night before. Form up over the island, dozens of fighters joining into tight formations. Set course for Japan. The flight north was long and often boring, punctuated by moments of terror, when weather closed in, or when an engine started running rough. Pilots would constantly scan their instruments. Oil pressure, oil temperature, coolant temperature, fuel levels. Every number had to be within limits, or the mission would end 800 miles from home, in cold Pacific waters. They flew in formation when possible, drawing comfort from the presence of other aircraft nearby. When clouds forced them onto instruments, they would spread out, maintaining spacing by radio calls and sheer luck. As they approached the Japanese coast, the tension would ratchet up, the external drop tanks would be jettisoned, falling away to tumble into the sea far below. Oxygen masks would be checked and tightened. Gun switches would be set to fire. Eyes would scan the sky, looking for the first sign of enemy fighters. Sometimes the Japanese would be waiting at the coast, having been alerted by radar. Other times they would hold back, waiting until the formation was deeper into Japanese airspace before committing their forces. The uncertainty was maddening. The dogfights, when they came, were brief and intense. Mustangs would break off from the bomber stream to engage Japanese fighters attempting to reach the B-29 seconds. The Americans fought with energy tactics, using their speed and the Mustang's excellent dive performance to make slashing attacks, then climbing back to altitude before the Japanese could react. The P-51 could outdive anything the Japanese had. It could outturn most of them, though the Zero and some of the other Japanese fighters still had an edge in sustained turning combat. So American pilots were taught to avoid getting into prolonged turning fights. Dive, attack, climb, extend. Never slow down. Speed is life. The Japanese tried various tactics to counter the Mustangs. Some units attempted head-on attacks, rushing straight at the American formations with all guns blazing. This was terrifying but rarely effective. The closure speed was enormous, giving only a second or two of firing time, and neither side could see the other's tracers to adjust their aim. Most head-on passes ended with both fighters flashing past each other unscathed, though occasionally a lucky hit would send an aircraft spinning earthward in flames. Other Japanese pilots tried to use their altitude advantage, climbing high above the American formations and then diving down in high-speed attacks. This worked better but required a level of tactical sophistication that many Japanese pilots lacked by this stage of the war. The diving attack had to be perfectly timed and perfectly aimed. Too early, and the Mustangs would see them coming and turn into the attack, spoiling the bounce. Too late, and the Japanese would overshoot, losing their energy advantage and becoming targets themselves. Some of the most dangerous Japanese pilots were the ramming attacks. Pilots who had expended their ammunition, or who were simply determined to bring down a B-29 at any cost, would deliberately fly their fighters into the bombers. This was not the organized kamikaze tactics that had been used against Navy ships. These were individual acts of desperation or fanaticism, pilots making the split-second decision to sacrifice themselves for one more kill. The Mustang pilots learned to watch for Japanese fighters that seemed to be positioning for ramming attacks and to shoot them down before they could reach the bombers. It was cold-blooded work, but necessary. The Japanese also experimented with dropping aerial bombs into bomber formations, a tactic that had some success on that first April 7th mission. A fighter would climb above the bombers, match speed with the formation, and then drop a bomb with a time delay fuse, hoping it would explode in the middle of the tightly packed B-29 seconds. It was difficult to execute and required excellent flying skills, but when it worked, it could bring down a bomber without the fighter having to get close enough to face the superfortress's defensive guns. The Americans countered by having the Mustangs patrol high above the bomber stream, ready to pounce on any Japanese fighter attempting this tactic. One piece of intelligence that reached the Japanese was both accurate and misleading, leading to an ironic outcome. American pilots flying the P-51D were equipped with the N9 gun sight, a relatively simple reflector sight that required the pilot to manually estimate range and lead. But some later production Mustangs were fitted with the K-14 gyroscopic gun sight, a sophisticated lead computing sight that automatically calculated the correct aiming point based on the target's range and angle. The K-14 was a significant advantage, making gunnery much easier and more accurate. The Japanese learned about the K-14, probably from interrogating captured pilots or examining downed aircraft. Their intelligence correctly identified it as a gyroscopic sight that would be disrupted if the aircraft pulled high G-forces during turning maneuvers. So they developed a counter tactic. When engaged by a Mustang, Japanese pilots in the Ki 84 Frank would enter a hard turn in one direction, then suddenly reverse to the opposite direction, hoping to topple the K-14's gyros and leave the American pilot without a functioning gun sight. The problem was that most P-51 seconds over Japan still had the old N9 sight. The K-14 was only being installed in newer aircraft, arriving as replacements. So when Japanese pilots executed their carefully planned reversal maneuvers, they were actually presenting American pilots flying aircraft with the N9 sight with a perfect no-deflection shot. The brief moment when the Japanese fighter reversed direction, it was flying nearly straight and level relative to the pursuing Mustang. For that split second, the American pilot didn't need a sophisticated gun sight at all. Just point and shoot. The Japanese lost a significant number of their precious key 84 seconds because of this tactical mistake before they realized what was happening and abandoned the tactic. By mid-June, the VLR missions were reaching their peak tempo. The three fighter groups were flying major strikes every few days, sometimes in conjunction with each other, sometimes independently. The targets ranged from the industrial heart of Japan around Tokyo and Osaka to airfields scattered across Honshu. The Americans would sweep in at first light, catching Japanese aircraft on the ground and in the process of taking off. Strafing runs destroyed fighters before they could engage, and damaged airfields, reducing Japan's ability to defend against the next raid. The pilots of 7 Fighter Command were racking up impressive scores. The 15th Fighter Group led the way with 111 confirmed kills between April and August. The 21st Fighter Group scored 71. The 506th Fighter Group, which arrived later and had less time in combat, still managed 24. In total, the Mustangs operating from Iwo Jima were credited with 206 Japanese aircraft shot down, representing 75% of all P-51 aerial victories in the Pacific Theater. It was a stunning achievement, made all the more impressive by the fact that the fighters were operating at the very limits of their range over hostile territory against a desperate enemy. Individual pilots became aces, the elite who had scored 5 or more confirmed aerial victories. Captain Abner Oss Jr. of the 506th Fighter Group became the last American ace of World War II. His 5 kills included 2 zeros and 3 key 84 francs, achieved in the final weeks of the war. He would go on to a distinguished career in the post-war Air Force. But he never forgot those missions from Iwo Jima, the long flights over water, the sudden violence of combat, the relief of seeing the volcanic island appear on the horizon during the flight home. The strain on the pilots was immense. Each VLR mission lasted between 7 and 9 hours, occasionally longer if weather or combat forced detours. That meant 7 to 9 hours strapped into a cramped cockpit, breathing oxygen through a mask, constantly monitoring instruments, staying alert for enemy fighters. The physical fatigue was compounded by the mental stress. Every pilot knew the statistics. They knew about Black Friday. They knew that more of their comrades had died from weather and mechanical failures than from enemy action. Every takeoff carried the knowledge that they might not make it back. The Air Force had established a rotation policy. A pilot who completed 15 VLR missions was eligible to go home. 15. It sounds like a small number, but when each mission carried a significant chance of death or disappearance into the Pacific, 15 felt like a lifetime. Some pilots didn't make it. First Lieutenant Fred White of the 78th Fighter Squadron bailed out on April 12th and did not survive. First Lieutenant Danny Mathis, flying Jerry Yellen's regular aircraft Dory R, went down on Black Friday. His body was never recovered. There were dozens more names on a casualty list that grew longer with each mission. The ground crews on Iwo Jima performed miracles keeping the Mustangs flying. Maintenance in that environment was a nightmare. The volcanic ash got into everything, wearing out engines and control systems at an accelerated rate. Salt spray from the ocean corroded metal parts. The heat and humidity played havoc with electronics and rubber seals. Yet the mechanics kept the aircraft flying, often working around the clock to prepare for the next mission. They developed innovative solutions to problems that the aircraft's designers had never anticipated. They cannibalized parts from damaged aircraft to keep others flying. They lived in the same miserable conditions as the pilots, breathing the same ash-filled air, dealing with the same heat and lack of amenities. But they took pride in their work. When a pilot came back from a mission and mentioned that his engine had been running rough, the mechanics would work through the night to fix it. By dawn, the aircraft would be ready to fly again. Spark plugs became a particular concern. The long cruise flights to and from Japan, running at low RPM to conserve fuel, tended to foul the plugs. Carbon would build up, causing the engine to run rough or even fail. So the ground crews developed a policy of changing spark plugs after every VLR mission. It was time-consuming and labor-intensive, but it dramatically reduced in-flight engine failures. Many crew chiefs went even further, waxing their aircraft to reduce drag and squeeze out a few more miles per hour of speed. Some claimed it was because there was nothing better to do on Iwo. Others admitted they wanted their pilot to have every possible advantage. As summer progressed, the strategic situation for Japan became increasingly desperate. The bombing campaign was destroying the country's industrial capacity and urban infrastructure. B-29 seconds were dropping thousands of tons of incendiary bombs on Japanese cities, creating firestorms that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The naval blockade had strangled imports, leaving Japan without the oil, metal, and raw materials needed to continue the war. Food was becoming scarce. The military was preparing for an invasion of the home islands, stockpiling aircraft and training pilots for kamikaze missions that everyone knew would be suicidal, but which were seen as the only way to inflict enough casualties on the Americans to force a negotiated peace. In this context, the VLR missions took on an even more important role. The P-51 seconds were not just escorting bombers, they were actively seeking out and destroying Japanese aircraft wherever they could be found. Airfields were strafed, fighters caught taking off were shot down before they could gain altitude, pilots sitting in their cockpits waiting for orders were killed by streams of .50 caliber bullets. It was brutal, unsporting by the standards of the gentleman fighter pilots of an earlier era. But this was total war, and the goal was to destroy Japan's ability to resist, to make continued fighting so costly that surrender would be the only rational choice. The Japanese pilots, for their part, fought with a desperation born of knowing they were defending their homes. Many had families in Tokyo or Osaka or Nagoya, living in the very cities that were being burned to the ground by American bombs. They were not fighting for an empire anymore. They were fighting to protect their parents, their wives, their children. This gave them a fierce determination, a willingness to press attacks even when the odds were hopeless. But determination could not overcome the material disadvantage they faced. They were outnumbered. They were flying aircraft that were often poorly maintained and low on fuel. They were inadequately trained. And they were facing pilots in aircraft that were, in most respects, simply better. In July, the tempo of operations increased even further. The Americans flew multiple missions per week, hitting targets across Japan. On July 9th, the 7th Fighter Command claimed 16 enemy aircraft destroyed, 5 probably destroyed, and 11 damaged. On July 16th, 44 enemy aircraft were destroyed or damaged in air combat. The numbers mounted. Every day, more Japanese fighters were being shot down, more pilots were being killed. Japan's air forces were being systematically destroyed, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. There were still losses on the American side. Captain Bimbo was lost over Nagoya on July 16th. His aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire during a strafing run, and he never made it out. Lieutenant John Wedham flew countless missions, always wondering if this would be the one where his luck ran out. Major Thomas DeJarnette led his flight against Japanese Tony fighters, waiting to ambush the bombers on June 10th. He shot one down, but several of his wingmen were hit. The randomness of combat meant that skill and experience only went so far. Sometimes it was just bad luck, being in the wrong place at the wrong second. By early August, it was clear the war was nearing its end. The Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan on August 8th, invading Manchuria with overwhelming force. American bombers were running out of targets. Most of Japan's major cities had already been destroyed. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th made it clear that Japan could not continue. The emperor himself would soon announce the surrender, though the military leadership resisted until the very end. On August 10th, the Mustangs of the 15th and 506th Fighter Groups scored the last aerial victories of the VLR campaign, claiming 7 kills near Tokyo. On August 14th, the 7th Fighter Command flew its 51st and final VLR mission. The pilots took off from Iwo Jima knowing that this might be the last combat mission of the war. When they returned, Emperor Hirohito had already recorded his surrender message, though it would not be broadcast until the following day. The war was over. The Mustangs had won. The cost had been significant. Between April and August 1945, V Fighter Command lost 131 fighters. Only a handful were shot down by enemy aircraft. Most were lost to weather, mechanical failure, fuel exhaustion, and simple accidents. 85 American fighter pilots died on VLR missions between July 1st and August 15th alone. These men did not die in glorious dogfights. They died alone in the Pacific Ocean, too far from land to swim, too far from rescue to be saved. Their aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched in the waves. Or they flew into a storm and never came out. Or their engines failed and they spiraled into the sea. They died doing one of the most demanding jobs ever asked of military aviators, pushing their aircraft and themselves to the absolute limits of human and mechanical endurance. But they achieved their objective. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan succeeded, in no small part because of the protection provided by the P-51 Mustangs flying from Iwo Jima. The bombers got through, the cities burned, and Japan's ability to continue the war was destroyed. The invasion of the home islands, which would have cost hundreds of thousands of American and Japanese lives, never had to happen. The war ended with a whimper rather than a bang, with a radio broadcast rather than a final desperate battle, and the Mustang pilots could finally go home. For the Japanese pilots who survived the war, the experience of fighting the P-51 seconds over their homeland was a bitter memory. They had done their best. They had fought bravely, often suicidally so. But they had been overwhelmed by an enemy with better training, better equipment, better logistics, and above all, more of everything. Numbers matter in war, and by 1945, Japan simply did not have the numbers. Every loss was irreplaceable. Every pilot shot down could not be replaced. Every aircraft destroyed was one less to defend the next raid. It was a war of attrition, and Japan was losing. Some Japanese pilots developed a deep respect for the Mustang and the men who flew it. They recognized that they had been facing a truly formidable opponent, an aircraft that represented the peak of piston engine fighter design. Others felt only bitterness and resentment, anger at having been put in an impossible situation by their own high command, sent into battle without adequate training or equipment, expected to win through sheer willpower when what they needed was fuel, spare parts, and time to train. In the decades after the war, historians would debate whether the capture of Iwo Jima and the VLR campaign had been worth the cost. The island had cost the lives of nearly 5,000 Marines to capture. The fighter operations from Iwo had cost over 100 aircraft and dozens of pilots. Had it made a decisive difference? Some argued that the B-29 seconds could have continued their campaign without fighter escort, as they had been doing since November 1944. They pointed out that relatively few bombers were actually saved by the fighter escort, that the Japanese interceptors were already weakened to the point that they posed a limited threat by the time the Mustangs arrived. But this analysis misses the psychological and strategic impact. The presence of the P-51 seconds changed the entire dynamic of the air war over Japan. Japanese pilots who had been focusing on attacking bombers now had to worry about defending themselves from escort fighters. This disrupted their tactics, forcing them to engage the escorts rather than pressing home attacks on the B-29 seconds. It meant that bomber crews who had been suffering significant casualties could now focus more on their bombing runs and less on fighting off determined interceptors. The morale boost alone was significant. B-29 crews knew that the Little Silver fighters were up there, protecting them, ready to dive down on any Japanese fighter that got too close. Moreover, the VLR missions allowed the Americans to take the fight directly to Japanese airfields and aircraft on the ground. The strafing missions destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft before they could even take off. Airfields were cratered, making operations difficult. Hangars and fuel storage facilities were destroyed. The systematic destruction of Japan's air forces in the summer of 1945 was made possible by the range and versatility of the P-51 operating from Iwo Jima. Without those missions, Japan would have retained a much larger air force for the final defense of the home islands, which would have made an invasion far more costly. The legacy of the VLR missions extended far beyond World War II. The techniques and tactics developed by 7 Fighter Command became the foundation for post-war long-range fighter operations. The idea that single-engine fighters could operate at extreme distances from their bases, refueling in the air if necessary, became a cornerstone of Air Force doctrine. The P-51 itself went on to serve in the Korean War, though by then it was being replaced by jets. But the lessons learned over the Pacific in the summer of 1945 informed the development of fighters like the F-86 Sabre and later the F-4 Phantom, aircraft that could strike deep into enemy territory and return home. For the men who flew those missions, the experience left an indelible mark. Many never spoke about it, finding it difficult to convey what it had been like to fly those endless hours over water, never certain they would see land again. Jerry Yellen, who flew 19 VLR missions, spent decades trying to come to terms with what he had experienced. He lost friends, watched aircraft disappear into clouds and never emerge, landed on Iwo with his fuel gauges reading empty, and wondered how he had made it. After the war, he struggled with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Flying had been his life, but after the war ended, he never wanted to fly again. The memories were too painful. Others threw themselves into post-war careers, determined to make something of the lives they had been given when so many of their friends had not been so lucky. Art Bridge became a successful businessman. Bob Scamara went into medicine. Abner Oss stayed in the Air Force, rising to the rank of colonel before retiring. They carried with them the knowledge that they had been part of something historic, that they had flown one of the greatest fighter aircraft ever built on some of the most demanding missions ever attempted. The P-51 Mustang itself became a legend. After the war, aviation enthusiasts sought out surviving examples, restoring them to flying condition and showcasing them at air shows around the world. The distinctive sound of the Merlin engine became synonymous with American air power in World War II. Aviation historians wrote books and articles analyzing every aspect of the aircraft's design and operational history. Model companies produced countless kits. Video games and movies featured the sleek silver fighter. For many people, the P-51 became the iconic American fighter of the war, more so even than the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt or the graceful P-38 Lightning. But for those who flew it in combat, the Mustang was more than an icon or a legend. It was the machine that had kept them alive. They knew every rivet, every switch, every quirk and characteristic. They knew the sound the engine made when it was running perfectly, and the different sound when something was wrong. They knew how to coax every last mile out of a tank of fuel, how to lean the mixture just right to keep the engine running smoothly while conserving gas. They knew the exact feel of the stick when the aircraft was about to stall, the way it shuddered just before a spin. This knowledge had been earned through hundreds of hours in the cockpit, through training and through combat. It was visceral, instinctive, and it had saved their lives more than once. The Japanese pilots who faced the Mustang developed their own understanding of the aircraft, though from a very different perspective. They learned to recognize its silhouette from a distance, the distinctive profile of the laminar flow wing and the bubble canopy. They learned that trying to outdive a Mustang was suicide, that the best chance of survival was to force it into a slow-speed turning fight where Japanese fighters still had some advantage. They learned that the P-51's guns, 650 caliber Browning machine guns, were devastatingly effective, that a burst from those guns could tear apart a lightly built Japanese fighter in seconds. And they learned that there was no escaping it. The Mustang could chase them anywhere, could follow them home to their bases, could stay over the target until its pilot decided it was time to leave. One Japanese pilot, interviewed years after the war, said that the arrival of the P-51 over Japan marked the moment when he knew the war was truly lost. It was not just that the Americans had a good fighter. It was that they had so many of them, and they could fly them all the way from Iwo Jima. And they had the fuel and the spare parts and the trained pilots to keep doing it day after day. It spoke to a level of industrial and military power that Japan simply could not match. The Mustang was a symbol of American might, a flying embodiment of the factories and training schools and logistical systems that stretched back across the Pacific to the United States itself. The technical achievement represented by the VLR missions cannot be overstated. In 1940, the idea of a single-engine fighter flying 1,500 miles to a target, engaging in combat, and flying back would have seemed like fantasy. The fighters of 1940, the Hurricanes and Messerschmitts and Zeros, had ranges measured in hundreds of miles, not thousands. They were designed for short-range interception and close support of ground forces. But the demands of the war, particularly the strategic bombing campaign, pushed aircraft designers to develop fighters with unprecedented range. The P-51's range came from several innovative design features. The laminar flow wing, designed by North American Aviation's engineers, reduced drag significantly compared to conventional wings. This meant the aircraft could fly farther on the same amount of fuel. The Merlin engine was extremely efficient, particularly at the cruising speeds used for long-range missions. The internal fuel capacity was generous, and the aircraft could carry 2 large external drop tanks that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat required it. All of these factors combined to create an aircraft that could go places no single-engine fighter had gone before. But range was only part of the equation. The P-51 also had to be able to fight when it got there. This was where the 650 caliber machine guns came in. Each gun was loaded with around 400 rounds, giving the pilot about 20 seconds of firing time if he held the trigger down continuously. In practice, pilots fired in short bursts, 1 or 2 seconds at a time, making the ammunition last for multiple engagements. The guns were harmonized to converge at a specific distance, usually around 300 yards, creating a cone of fire that was devastatingly effective against enemy aircraft. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was one of the best aircraft guns of the war. It fired a heavy bullet at high velocity, capable of punching through aluminum skin, shattering spars, cutting control cables, and destroying engines. A solid burst into a Japanese fighter would usually be enough to bring it down. The gun was reliable, rarely jamming even in the extreme conditions of combat, and it had good range, meaning a skilled pilot could shoot down an enemy aircraft from distances that put him outside the range of lighter Japanese weapons. The gun sight made a tremendous difference in effectiveness. The N9 reflector sight, while simple, allowed a pilot to aim without having to line up iron sights, keeping his head up and his eyes on the target. The more advanced K-14 gyroscopic sight, when it was available, calculated lead automatically, making deflection shooting much easier. But even with the best gun sight, shooting down an enemy aircraft required skill, practice, and a certain amount of luck. The target was moving, often erratically. The shooting platform was moving. The range was constantly changing. Wind, altitude, and G-forces all affected bullet trajectories. A pilot had to judge all of these factors in a fraction of a second and pull the trigger at exactly the right moment. Most of the top-scoring aces were not necessarily the best flyers. They were the best shots. They understood bullet ballistics instinctively. They knew how to get close, to maneuver into the perfect firing position, and to wait for the moment when everything aligned. Then they would fire, a short burst, and the enemy aircraft would start trailing smoke or fire, spinning down toward the earth or the sea. It looked easy when done by an expert. It was anything but. The P-51 pilots also learned to use the aircraft's performance advantages strategically. The Mustang accelerated well in a dive, reaching speeds that few Japanese fighters could match. So the standard tactic was to maintain altitude and speed, diving down to attack and then zooming back up before the enemy could react. This was called boom and zoom, and it was devastatingly effective when done correctly. The Japanese would try to turn with the diving Mustang, but by the time they had completed their turn, the American was already climbing away, out of range and out of reach. Speed was life in aerial combat. An aircraft that was moving fast was hard to hit and had options. It could extend away from the fight if things went badly. It could choose when and where to engage. It could dictate the terms of the combat. An aircraft that was slow was vulnerable, an easy target for any enemy that managed to get behind it. The P-51 pilots understood this at a fundamental level. They were trained never to slow down unless absolutely necessary. Keep the speed up. Keep the energy high. Never get caught slow and low, the most dangerous position a fighter pilot could find himself in. The doctrine of energy fighting, as it came to be known, was not new. Fighter pilots in World War I had understood that altitude and speed could be converted into each other, and that maintaining energy was crucial. But by World War II, with faster aircraft and more powerful engines, energy fighting became even more important. The German expert on the Eastern Front had perfected these tactics against Soviet fighters. American pilots learned from captured German documents and from their own experience in combat. By the time the Mustangs reached Japan, energy fighting had become the standard American tactical doctrine. The Japanese, by contrast, had been trained in maneuver fighting. Their doctrine emphasized tight turns, slow speed combat, and dogfighting skills. This had worked well early in the war when Japanese fighters were more maneuverable than anything the Allies could field. The Zero's legendary turning ability had allowed it to dominate the skies over China and the Pacific in 1941 and 42. But by 1945, that advantage had been negated by Allied aircraft that were faster and more heavily armed. A Zero might be able to turn inside a Mustang, but if the Mustang never stayed in the turn, if it just slashed through and climbed away, the Zero's advantage was meaningless. There were exceptions, of course. Some Japanese pilots adapted to the new reality, learning to fight more like the Americans, using hit-and-run tactics and avoiding prolonged engagements. These pilots were dangerous, and the Americans learned to respect them, but they were few in number, and they could not change the overall trajectory of the air war. By the summer of 1945, Japan was simply running out of everything: fuel, aircraft, parts, and most critically, trained pilots. No amount of individual skill or tactical innovation could overcome that fundamental shortage. The fuel situation in Japan by mid-1945 was catastrophic. The synthetic fuel plants that Japan had relied on were being systematically destroyed by B-29 raids. The sea lanes from the Dutch East Indies, where Japan's oil came from, had been cut by American submarines and carrier strikes. The refineries that remained operational were producing fuel of increasingly poor quality, lacking the additives and octane rating that high-performance engines required. Japanese pilots reported that their aircraft simply would not perform as advertised. Engines that should have produced 1,800 horsepower were producing 1,500 or less. Maximum speeds were lower than spec sheets indicated. Climb rates were reduced, all because the fuel was not good enough. This created a vicious cycle. Poor fuel led to poor performance, which led to more losses, which led to a greater need to throw untrained pilots into combat, which led to even more losses. Meanwhile, the Americans were operating with abundant supplies of high-quality 100-octane aviation gasoline, ensuring that their aircraft performed at or above their rated specifications. The Merlin engine in the P-51 was designed to run on high-octane fuel, and when it got it, it was a masterpiece of reliability and power. The performance advantage this gave the Americans was difficult to quantify but impossible to deny. Maintenance was another area where the Americans had an overwhelming advantage. The ground crews on Iwo Jima had access to a steady supply of spare parts shipped in from the United States. If an engine needed to be replaced, a new one was available. If a propeller was damaged, there were spares. If instruments failed, replacements could be installed. The Japanese, by contrast, were cannibalizing aircraft to keep others flying. Spare parts were virtually non-existent. Damaged aircraft that could have been repaired with the proper parts were written off as total losses. Engines were run far beyond their service life because there were no replacements available. This meant that Japanese aircraft were often operating at reduced capability even before they encountered the enemy. The disparity in training has already been mentioned, but it bears repeating because it was perhaps the single most important factor in the air war over Japan. An American pilot arriving at Iwo Jima had typically gone through 9 months to a year of training. He had logged hundreds of hours in various aircraft types, learning to fly by instruments, to navigate, to shoot, to dogfight. He had practiced emergency procedures until they were second nature. He had been taught by instructors who had combat experience, who passed on the lessons they had learned in the skies over Europe or the Pacific. By the time he flew his first combat mission, he was as prepared as it was possible to be. A Japanese pilot in the summer of 1945 might have as little as 3 months of training with fewer than 100 hours of flight time. He would have minimal gunnery practice, limited formation flying experience, and almost no instruction in modern air combat tactics. He would be thrown into combat against an enemy that was better trained, better equipped, and more experienced. The results were predictable. Japanese losses mounted, the pool of experienced pilots shrank, and the training standards had to be lowered even further to produce replacements quickly. It was an unsustainable situation. There were moments of individual heroism and skill that transcended these material and training differences. Japanese pilots who managed to survive their first few missions learned quickly. They developed situational awareness, the ability to track multiple aircraft simultaneously, to anticipate threats, to position themselves advantageously. They learned which fights to take and which to avoid. They became aces in their own right, respected by friend and enemy alike. But there were never enough of them, and they could not be everywhere at once. American pilots, too, had to learn and adapt. The Pacific was different from Europe. The distances were greater, the weather was worse. The enemy, while often less experienced, fought with a fanaticism that could be unnerving. Japanese pilots who were out of ammunition or badly damaged would sometimes deliberately ram American aircraft rather than bailing out. It was not official policy in the same way kamikaze attacks were, but it happened often enough that American pilots had to watch for it, had to make sure that a Japanese fighter they thought was fleeing was not actually positioning for a ramming attack. The psychological toll of VLR missions accumulated over time. It was not just the physical exhaustion of 8-hour flights. It was the stress of knowing that engine failure meant death, that running out of fuel meant death, that weather could kill you just as surely as enemy action, that even if everything went perfectly, you still had to fly back over hundreds of miles of empty ocean to reach Iwo Jima. And if you missed the island in bad weather, there was nowhere else to go. Some pilots developed superstitions, lucky jackets, lucky planes, lucky formations, anything that might tilt the odds even slightly in their favor. Others became grimly fatalistic, figuring that if their number was up, there was nothing they could do about it. A few broke under the pressure, grounding themselves or finding ways to avoid flying. But most just kept going, mission after mission, because that was the job, because their friends were doing it, because the B-29 crews were depending on them, because the war had to be won. After Black Friday, there was greater caution about weather. Missions would be postponed or canceled if conditions looked too dangerous. Better forecasting methods were developed, with B-29 seconds flying weather reconnaissance missions ahead of the main formations to report actual conditions rather than relying on predictions. Radio navigation aids were improved, rescue procedures were refined, with submarines and seaplanes positioned along the flight routes to pick up downed pilots. These measures reduced losses, though they could never eliminate them entirely. The end of the war in August 1945 came as both a relief and an anticlimax for the Mustang pilots. They had been preparing for an invasion of Japan, expecting that the war would continue into 1946 with even greater intensity. The atomic bombs changed everything. Suddenly, after years of war, it was over. The mission stopped. The aircraft sat on their hard stands on Iwo Jima. The pilots, many of whom had been living with the expectation that they might not survive the war, now had to process the fact that they were going to go home. The transition was jarring. One day they were flying combat missions, hunting enemy aircraft, dodging anti-aircraft fire. The next day, the war was over, and they were filling out paperwork and waiting for transport back to the States. Some pilots flew their Mustangs to occupation airfields in Japan, landing on the same fields they had been strafing weeks earlier. They met Japanese pilots, their former enemies, and found them to be professional,